and welcome to today's video on My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Before we begin, just a recap of the highlighters you're going to need for the highlighting code. So yellow, word analysis, pink, language device analysis, green, structural analysis, and then orange, key ideas about power and conflict, which are easy to link to the other poems. So we'll begin with some contextual stuff about Robert Browning before we go into the poem. It's quite a long one, and often people think that it's quite difficult to link to other poems in the cluster. It's actually used on the AQA A-level. I teach it at A-level to do with crime. And if you sort of view it as a poem about a crime and a criminal telling about why they committed their crime, it makes it a little bit more exciting, a little bit more interesting. And it's all about the power and control that a criminal enjoys having. So Robert Browning was a Victorian poet in that, you know, the bulk of his poems were published in Victorian times. And he was a poet who really shocked his readers because a lot of his... he even had a collection of poems called Madhouse Cells, which were all about criminals that had lost their sanity. And he has a few poems which write from the kind of mindset of the criminal, either committing a crime or planning a crime. And this really shocked kind of the sensible, sensitive nature of Victorian readers. Now, what this poem is about contextually, if we think historically, is about attitudes to women and how they change and whether they should change. And many people at the time thought that Browning himself was a bit of a misogynist. And you kind of have to consider, once you've read it, whether you think that he's showing that what the Duke did is right and he had the right to kill his wife, or whether he's questioning that. And that's up to your interpretation. Now, the poem is loosely based on a real story, a 16th century Duke, the Duke of Ferrara. And the reason we know that is that we have in the kind of subtitle of the poem the name Ferrara. Now, you can do a little bit of research about him, but essentially he was believed to have killed his first wife by poison, and I think then he had like another wife who he killed. Well, they thought he killed, and all of his wives were quite a bit younger than him. I think the first one, she was 14 when he married her, and he was a fair bit older, and then he married another woman who died mysteriously. So there's a lot of kind of mystery around him as an individual, and many thought that, you know, he was involved in these crimes at the time, and in Victorian times that's what they believed. So we'll go on now and we'll have a read of the poem.
My Last Duchess. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Wilt please you sit and look at her? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only that called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one. My favourite, her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mules she rode with around the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men. Good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-years-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such a one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss or there exceed the mark, and if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive. Wilt please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the count your master's no munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me.
Okay, because it's another one of the really long poems, what we're going to do is just write some little summaries of each chunk of the poem, just so we've got a sense of what's happening, because it's kind of another kind of narrative one with a lot going on. So it just help you to understand in each phase of the poem. So we're going to start by looking at line 1 to 13-ish, from here to here. Okay, now in these lines, the Duke is speaking to somebody. We'll call him a listener, but he's basically someone who's arranging a new marriage for the Duke. And they view a painting of the Duke's late wife. And there's a sense of the Duke having power and control over this painting and kind of asking questions for the listener about the painting, as if he just wants to talk about it. Now, if we look to line 14 here, actually that's up to line 12, sorry. I will look for line 13 up to 21. This kind of chunk here. Now, what the Duke is explaining here is the kind of act of her having her her painting made. So it explains how, in particular, he focuses on her blushing when she was painted, which is probably quite an awkward thing to go through, sitting there for hours whilst somebody draws you. But it bothers the Duke, definitely, that she was painting and the artist kind of said something about how she was sitting, etc. And what we now have is line... I've done it again, haven't I? I've done the wrong line number, but let's just change it to here, it's fine. So from line 22 up to... all the way onto the next page, 31. Line. Now, what the Duke then goes on to explain, because he controls the whole narrative of the poem, he begins to explain all the things his Duchess did that annoyed him, her flaws, and in particular he emphasises the fact that she was easily impressed, too happy, and that really bothers him. which links to the context, doesn't it? The fact that he was married to a lot of younger women, so perhaps it was just kind of a naivety from these women that they were just quite, like happy with things, and that bothers him. We'll come on to that specifically when we look at that section. Then we look at 32 to 43. Now in this section, this is when it kind of builds. So the Duke's anger and annoyance at her being easily impressed grows, but he refuses. He basically says he's not willing to teach her to improve. He's not willing to help her learn how to behave, because he doesn't want to lower himself, or stoop is the word he uses, and teach her. So this young girl is obviously unable to please him, but he isn't willing to explain to her why she isn't pleasing him, because that would be lowering himself to her level. And that's up to 43. And then finally, the end of the poem, which is 44 to 56, we learn that the Duke gives some sort of order to stop the Duchess from smiling or doing the things that annoy him. And then he goes back to talking to this listener, and he starts talking about his next wife, basically, and his artwork that he has around his kind of castle, palace. Okay, so that's a summary of what happens in the poem and kind of 5 stages of the poem. What we're going to do now is go into annotating in a little bit more detail. So we'll start with something that is always important with this poem, which is the kind of title is used in the very first line. And there's lots you can unpick from this title, but I think the most important thing is the use of pronouns. So we've got my for My Last Duchess. And then if you track through the poem, you'll see a lot of use of pronouns, okay, throughout the whole poem, first person pronouns. Now, we'll start with my. Now, in this case, he's talking about his last wife. The fact that he uses my all the time when he speaks about her shows how he feels he has ownership over her, and almost that she's an object that he can control and have power over. And that's partly because he's talking about a painting, but it's also partly how he viewed his relationship with her. And this obviously links then to the repetition of first person throughout the poem, which again just highlights the Duke's self-absorption, selfish ways, narcissism, arrogance, love for himself, basically. We'll go for highlights, Duke's arrogance for now, but all those words that obviously we used when we looked at Ozymandias, they all come into play with this poem, most definitely. So, what the Duke uses, he's very clever with his words, and that's what makes him such an interesting criminal to think about, and how he's so interesting in how he uses power. What he does throughout the poem is he uses quite a lot of questions, but whether he actually intends for an answer is always quite interesting. Now, this is a really good example of what he's doing, because he's using kind of a rhetorical question in the sense that there's no answer given. Ooh, we can only assume that the listener, who is an emissary who's sent from the new... So the Duke is marrying a new woman, and her father has sent someone to kind of arrange this new marriage, and that's who he's talking to about his last wife who he killed, which is a little bit strange, I know, but there we are. He kind of controls and dominates what the listener does. And this just shows his desire for power and control. Now, not only that, that's all. We take that from the kind of idea of him asking questions but not giving time for an answer. If we also look at what he's doing in this quotation, he's actually asking the man to sit down so that he is above him physically. And the Duke has an obsession with kind of, I guess, levels is the way to look at it, but not stooping, not lowering himself. So I think it's really interesting that he asks the emissary to sit down, despite the fact that the emissary is here to arrange a marriage and he is the one who should have the power. We'll skip down for a little bit and I want you to look at this bit here, where what the Duke is saying is, when people look at this painting, but people can only look at it when I'm here because nobody moves this curtain other than me. And nobody dares to ask me a certain question. So we get a sense that people fear the Duke. And they have a reason to. So a duke is based in Italy, and a duke is kind of almost like a king or a lord of an area, kind of above a lord really, and what we would understand of it. So he's someone with a lot of power and a lot of status, and he uses that power and status over others. And he restricts who can see the painting. And I think that's interesting because it shows us how he, again, wants to treat his Duchess, even though she's not alive, she's just in a painting. He still wants to treat her as an object and something that he can restrict access to and restrict what other people see of her. So we just come down here. So this is the bit where he explains the things that annoy him about her. And it's quite a nice bit to pick out, but we can just highlight this idea of spot of joy. And he repeats it twice. And the reason it's repeated is because it kind of focuses us as a reader on this idea of a spot of joy. Now, the spot of joy is her blushing. And I think it's interesting. So it suggests, the repetition suggests the Duke's focus is on her blushing. But I always find it really interesting because a blush is something you can't control. So we can question to what extent this woman is at fault here, that she's kind of having her painting taken and she's blushing. He's obviously assuming that she's too happy around other men, too happy around other people, and that bugs her. But whether we can read it as she is happy around other men and he's right, or you might read it as this is just how he interprets what she's doing. So that asks us to question that. Now what we're going to look at now is a few structural things, and lots of them come in here and onto the next page. Now the whole poem is a speech by the Duke, so it's a dramatic monologue because he's saying it out loud, and it's one person speaking to a listener. And what that does is that enables him to have absolute control over what is said, and almost control over the situation. That's what it's kind of all about for the Duke. And that dramatic monologue just allows him to just not stop and to give everything away. But he just doesn't give in. He doesn't give the other person a voice. Now, what it also does is it shows how he's able to control his speech. And also, we can kind of figure out when he's slipping up because of the way that Browning structures it. So we've got this line here, a heart, how shall I say? So he's almost thinking very carefully about the things that he shares with the listener. What we also have structurally is the use of rhyme. And some of the rhymes are quite interesting to look at because it's obviously something that the Duke is kind of pairing together. So fool and mule is quite interesting. A mule is a donkey, and he's getting angry about somebody giving her some cherries in the orchard. And then he gets angry at the fact that she enjoys having rides on the donkey. So the fool and the mule rhyming together is obviously a little hint of how he thinks like men are donkeys and everyone's a pain to him, I guess, and everyone's a fool. But you definitely get this sense that he can control what he's saying, because he says, how shall I say? And if you look over here onto the next page, line 35 to 36, he says, even if you had skill in speech, which I have not. So he almost pretends that he doesn't know how to use language, but it's just a form of manipulation. He definitely does know how to control what he's saying and to be really careful what he's saying. And so there's quite a lot to say about structure here. So we're just going to do it as a box down here. So things to do with structure. As we said, dramatic monologue, allows Duke to have control over entire conversation, and I'll put in brackets manipulate, because that's what he does. He pretends he doesn't know how to say things, but he definitely does. What we then have is the use of rhyme. And I'll just put that highlights links for the Duke. So for the example there of fool and mule. And that ties in men as donkeys. So how he sees anyone who speaks to the Duchess. And then finally we've got use of caesura. Now Browning's quite clever with these, because sometimes they are the Duke pausing, but as we'll see in a second, it also indicates his anger. Because there's one point where he uses a lot of caesuras because he kind of loses control of what he's saying. There's a couple of points actually. So we've got three things there. We've got dramatic monologue, rhyme and caesura. And there's often enjambment as well, where ideas are kind of ongoing as his voices, because he loves the sound of his own voice, is definitely the impression I think Browning wants us to have of him. Now we have on this next page a few key quotations. So we'll start with up here, my gift of a 900 years old name. So I'm not gonna do something too complicated, but the picture is a little present. Okay, and we're going to do this in pink because it's a language technique. So what the Duke's doing here is he's getting angry because she thinks she doesn't realise how important having his name is. And he uses the metaphor that his name is a gift. And I think this is a really nice quotation to tell you a lot about the Duke. Because what it tells you is that he feels like he has ownership over everything, even her name, once they're married. And a present, the metaphor of a gift is something you can take back. It doesn't feel like he's truly given her this name. It's definitely something which he only still sees as his, and his alone. And it's a gift. It's almost like he's done a really nice, wonderful thing by giving it to her. And again, you've got the my pronoun. So first person again, that he owns the name. And this emphasis on it being 900 years old. The Duke is absolutely in love with himself. He's self-obsessed, right? But he's also obsessed with the with status and his, I guess you could say, legacy, which obviously, as I'm saying this, is a really obvious, clear link to Ozymandias and the dictator in that, who is also an arrogant narcissist who loves himself. Now, in Ozymandias, obviously, it doesn't work out too well for the ruler, but in here, I guess he has his power, although he loses her in a sense through his own choice, I guess. So again, we've got this control of speech, these caesuras, with him kind of acting like he's thinking of all these things. And now we move on to the point where he becomes obsessed with the idea of being above her and being better than others. So he asks who would stoop to blame this sort of trifling, who'd lower themselves to really talk to her about her behaviour, who would... if I did it, it would be really stooping, really lowering myself, and I choose never to stoop, with a nice little caesura there. So he really pauses on that moment through choice, I think. So the repetition of stoop, I think, again, is a real important quotation and moment for the Duke, because it's all about how he doesn't want to lean down, to kneel, to lower himself to the Duchess. Which shows obviously a lack of equality in their relationship, which I guess wouldn't necessarily be uncommon in Victorian times, and also wouldn't be uncommon in a relationship in the monarchy. But by refusing to lower himself, by refusing to stoop, he can't engage with her and tell her what he doesn't like. He just gets quietly angry and frustrated. And what this does is builds the anger and frustration for him, because he can't change. Well, it's not that he can, I guess he won't change her behaviour. Whether her behaviour is wrong is a very different question. But definitely, at least the Duke thinks her behaviour is wrong. And now we get to the moment where he essentially admits to having her killed, knocked off, sort of thing. And it's always a really interesting moment, because it shows the complete power he has, that he can be saying to this person who's trying to arrange another marriage, oh, I just got rid of her. And that he believes that he's got so much power and so much status that nothing will happen to him. And definitely Browning showing us that nothing does happen to him. There's definitely the sense that he's just going to move on and get another woman, which the original Duke of Ferrara did. So it is quite ambiguous. And some people suggest that he just sent her off to a nunnery, but I definitely think there's something quite sinister going on here. Because you'd think if all smiles stop, I don't see how that they would all stop if he sent her away. And this command, okay, this noun command, I think is really interesting, because it shows his control, his power, and it's a really clear link to Ozymandias, where it says sneer of cold command. So they're both two kind of rulers, in a sense, that think they have absolute control and can command everyone around them. And again, just to link back to earlier, we talked about the rhetorical questions. He demands for when the speaker should rise. So he basically gets to the point where he admits to killing her, and then he's like, oh, there she is in the painting, let's stand up, let's go. So it kind of builds to this real climax of, oh, I had her killed, and then he just moves on. And what he then talks about is this next wife, okay? And there's a really interesting word used. He says, like I said when we started talking, this new daughter, this daughter of this new guy, is my object. So this is kind of polysemous language, really, because object here means objective, right? So he's saying this next woman is my target, is my next victim. And we're definitely, I think Browning is definitely making us think that this isn't over. Is the Duke ever going to be happy with how a woman behaves? But obviously, object also suggests ownership. So he's basically saying she's the next thing I can buy. And that is what's going on. They're kind of deciding kind of a transaction. Okay, and love and marriage, especially in a high status, with a high status man in 16th century, would be about money. It's just a transaction to him. So just go back to this quotation here, because I've just realised I didn't draw the picture. It's pretty simple. It's just a face without a smile. There we go. And then finally, we've got this final quotation, which is kind of symbolic, and it's a really good one. I'm going to try and draw this seahorse, which is going to be horrendous, but we'll give it a go. So the Duke is now talking. If the pen will work, that'd be great. The Duke is now talking about a final piece of art, okay? And he describes it as Neptune taming a seahorse, okay? So you've got to imagine this kind of... I'll bring a picture up of it on the screen, actually, because I think there's an example one. We're talking about a piece of art where a giant god, Neptune, the god of the ocean, is taming a seahorse, which is a kind of small, insignificant animal. So notice... Let's just unpick this quotation because there's quite a lot in it. Now this quotation is, I would say, it's symbolic, right? It represents everything that we need to know about the Duke and his attitude towards women. So, and others. So first of all, we've got an imperative verb. This is how we can really explode this quotation. There's so much to unpick from it. So imperative verb tells us that he is still commanding the listener. Okay, and he expects him to do what he says. Now, Neptune is the god of the ocean. And this is how the Duke sees himself. So he is Neptune. Okay, and that again highlights his arrogance and his narcissistic ways. Okay, this is a man who is absolutely in love with himself and thinks that he is like God. Okay, very similar to Ozymandias, King of Kings. Now the verb taming is obviously quite interesting. So it shows how he wants to have control over these women and kind of domesticate them and, mould them and make them who he wants them to be. And the idea of taming obviously also shows a bit of a kind of master-animal relationship, right? So sees himself as a master and women as animals, which obviously means that they're below him, subservient to him. And finally, this seahorse is just an insignificant, small creature, small, therefore weak. And then this symbolises how the Duke, his perspective on women. So what a lovely, lovely man he is. So there's lots to unpick in there. Notice how we've also almost looked at every single word. So the imperative verb, Neptune, symbolic of him, the verb taming, how he treats women and how he sees his relationship with women, his dominance over women, and then the seahorse, which represents how he sees women. So there's absolutely loads to unpick from this poem, but in summary, it's essentially a poem of a man who wants to have absolute control over his wife and feels that she doesn't understand his power and his status, and gets so annoyed with that rather than help her, he decides to kill her, and he's already moving on to find another woman, another object that he can control and dominate.